She always sent letters to her deceased ex-fiancé, but one day she received a surprising response. Rebecca Mason sat at her antique oak desk, as she had done every Friday night since the tragic accident that had taken Michael 2 years ago. The Boston apartment maintained its usual silence, broken only by the soft drumming of her fingers on the paper as she searched for the right words for yet another letter. At 32, Rebecca was still as beautiful as the day Michael had asked her to marry him, although her brown eyes now carried a permanent melancholy. Her red hair, once always perfectly groomed, fell carelessly over her shoulders as she leaned over the paper. Dear Michael, today marks exactly 104 weeks since you left. Sometimes I still wake up expecting to find you on the other side of the bed, with that crooked smile of yours, like you've just cracked a private joke. You know that new coffee shop that opened on the corner of Commonwealth Avenue? I'm sure you would have loved it. They make that cinnamon coffee you loved so much. Rebecca paused, looking at the tears that were beginning to stain the paper. On the office wall, the photo of their engagement day seemed to watch her, Michael hugging her from behind, both of them smiling in front of Fenway Park, where he had proposed during the 7th inning of a Red Sox game. The letters began as part of his therapy. Dr. Martinez had suggested that writing could help with the grieving process, but it quickly turned into something more. It was her connection to Michael, her way of keeping his memory alive, and, above all, of processing the guilt that consumed her. I stopped by the construction company today. The community center project you were developing has finally been approved. I know you'd be proud to see how it turned out. Your partner, Robert, kept every detail you planned, even that peculiar skylight you insisted it had to have. The phone rang, interrupting her flow of thoughts. It was Charlotte, her best friend, and the only person who knew about the letters apart from her therapist. Beck, you need to go out for a while. You haven't shown up for the firm's happy hour in 2 weeks. Charlotte sounded concerned. I'm busy, Char. I've got that important case to review and the Patterson case can wait. You're the best corporate lawyer in Boston, but you can't live only for work and… Charlotte hesitated. And for the letters? Rebecca sighed, looking at the pile of envelopes carefully organized in a wooden box on the desk, each one addressed to Michael's old apartment in Cambridge, where he lived before the engagement. They're important to me, Char. You know that. I know, darling. But Michael wouldn't want to see you like this, especially after so long. Charlotte's words hit Rebecca like a punch in the gut. She knew her friend was right, but there was something in the letters that stopped her from moving on. Perhaps it was the fact that, while writing, she could pretend that Michael was still there, that that terrible day had never happened. If I hadn't asked him to pick me up that night, Rebecca began, but Charlotte interrupted her. Don't do that to yourself. The snowstorm was unpredictable. No one could have prevented that accident. Rebecca turned her eyes to the unfinished letter. The words seemed to dance across the page, mingling with the memories of that fateful night. The snow falling heavily, the anxious phone call asking Michael to pick her up from the office, the call from the police 2 hours later. I need to finish this letter, Charm. I'll talk to you later, okay? After hanging up, Rebecca resumed writing, her hands trembling slightly. Sometimes I wonder if you can hear me, if these words will somehow reach you. I know it seems crazy to keep writing after so long, but it's as if a part of me refuses to accept that you're really gone. Each letter is a promise unfulfilled, a dream interrupted, a conversation we never had. The clock on the wall read almost midnight when she finally finished. As always, she carefully sealed the envelope, wrote down the family address and put a stamp on it. Tomorrow, during her morning run, she would drop the letter in the mailbox on the corner, as she did every week. What Rebecca didn't know was that this letter would be different, not because of its content, but because of what was about to happen. Somewhere in Cambridge, someone was about to receive one of these letters, someone who would completely change the course of her life. As she prepared for bed, Rebecca looked at the engagement photo once more. Michael's smile, frozen in time, looked different now, as if it held a secret she wasn't yet ready to discover. The next day, as she put the letter in the letterbox, Rebecca felt something different, a restlessness she couldn't explain. It was as if the universe was holding its breath, waiting for the right moment to reveal its plans. Little did she know that it would be the last letter she would write without a reply. Life, in its mysterious wisdom, was about to offer a twist that not even her deepest desires could have imagined. The next morning, Marcus Sullivan, an assistant professor of architecture at MIT, found a pile of mail when he arrived at his new apartment in Cambridge. Among the bills and advertisements, one envelope in particular caught his eye, addressed to Michael Bennett, the former resident. Normally, Marcus would simply mark it addressee unknown and return it to the post office, as he had done with other lost mail since moving into the apartment 3 months ago. But something about this letter was different. The elegant handwriting, the faint scent of lavender emanating from the paper, and above all, the small stains that looked like dried tears on the envelope. Rebecca Mason, he read the sender's name, turning the envelope over in his hands. Sitting at his desk, filled with architectural plans and scale models, Marcus debated with himself about what to do. A quick online search revealed the tragedy. Michael Bennett, a promising architect, had died in a car accident during a snowstorm 2 years ago. The news mentioned that he was on his way to pick up his fiancée when it happened. The bride's name? Rebecca Mason. My God, Marcus muttered, the realization of what that letter meant hitting him like a punch in the gut. His brown eyes fixed on the pile of student work he had to correct, but his mind was far away, thinking of the woman who continued to write letters to her dead fiancé. Marcus knew the pain of loss well. 5 years ago, he had lost his younger sister, Claire, to cancer. For months after her death, he had also written letters, although his own had never been sent, remaining locked in a drawer in his apartment. The phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. It was Andrea, his colleague from the architecture department. Marcus, you won't believe it. I've just discovered that the community center we're using as an example in the Sustainable Design course was originally designed by Michael Bennett. The name made Marcus straighten up in his chair. What do you know about him? He was a brilliant architect. He died a few years ago, but he left behind some incredible projects. You actually live in his old apartment, don't you? The address is the same. Marcus looked at the letter again. Yes, that's quite a coincidence. After hanging up, he spent the whole afternoon researching Michael Bennett. He discovered that he and Rebecca were considered the perfect couple in their social circle. Michael was known for his innovative work in sustainable architecture, something that Marcus was also passionate about. In the evening, alone in his apartment, Marcus finally opened the letter. He knew he shouldn't, that it was an invasion of his privacy, but something stronger compelled him. Perhaps it was the loneliness that had consumed him since moving to Boston, or perhaps it was the echo of his own loss that he recognized in Rebecca's pain. Her words touched him deeply. The way she described her longing, how she kept Michael alive through her daily observations, how she carried the guilt over the accident, all of it resonated with his own experience of grief. Marcus spent hours sitting in his worn leather armchair, rereading the letter over and over again. The apartment, which he had previously seen only as a convenient place near the campus, took on a new dimension. Those walls had witnessed Michael and Rebecca's love story. Looking out of the window at the lights of Cambridge flickering in the night, Marcus made a decision that would change not only his life, but Rebecca's too. He picked up a piece of paper and a pen and began to write, "Dear Rebecca, you don't know me, but I received your letter to Michael. I'm the current resident of his apartment." He stopped, crumpled up the paper and started again. "Rebecca, maybe it's wrong of me to answer this letter, but something tells me I have to, not to bring more pain, but perhaps to help heal." Again, he wasn't sure. After several attempts, he finally found the right words. "Your letter reached me. I'm a professor of architecture at MIT and currently live in Michael's former apartment. Normally, I would return the mail to the post office, but something made me read it. I apologize for the invasion of privacy. I've also known the pain of loss, and I recognize in your words the same kind of longing I felt. The community center project you mentioned? It's used as an example in my sustainable architecture classes. Michael's work continues to inspire people. If you want me to stop receiving your letters, I'll understand completely. But if you need someone to talk to, someone who might understand a little of what you're feeling, you can keep writing. Sincerely, Marcus Sullivan." He reread the letter several times before finally sealing it in an envelope. He knew he was taking a risk. Rebecca could be furious. She could report him for reading her private correspondence. She could simply ignore him, but something inside him told him he was doing the right thing. The next day, before leaving to teach his classes, Marcus dropped the letter off at the post office. As he walked around the MIT campus, he couldn't stop thinking about Rebecca and the words he had written to her. He had started something that he didn't know exactly where it would end, but for the first time in a long time, he felt he was on the right track. Autumn in Cambridge painted the trees red and gold, and a gentle wind carried the leaves through the streets. Marcus looked up at the crystal blue sky and thought about how life sometimes surprises us with unexpected connections. Now all that remained was to wait and see if Rebecca would respond. Rebecca was sitting in her office at the law firm when her assistant, Jennifer, came in with the day's mail. Among the legal documents and journals, an envelope immediately caught her eye. Her heart stopped for a moment as she recognized her own address as the sender. Had the letter she had sent to Michael come back? Her hands trembled as she examined the envelope, but then she noticed something different. The handwriting wasn't hers, and the sender's name caught her completely off guard. Marcus Sullivan. "I need a moment," she said to Jennifer, who nodded discreetly and closed the door on her way out. Rebecca was paralyzed, staring at the envelope as if it was something explosive. After 2 years of sending letters to Michael's old address, this was the first time she had received a reply. Her mind was spinning with possibilities and fears. With trembling fingers, she opened the envelope and began to read. Every word from Marcus hit her like a wave, bringing a confusing mix of emotions. Shame that her letters had been read by a stranger, surprise at the kindness of his tone, and a strange sense of relief that there was finally some kind of response from the universe. Michael's work continues to inspire people. This sentence in particular made her cry. They weren't tears of pure sadness like the ones she'd shed so many times before, but something different, something that carried a hint of comfort. The phone rang, making her jump. It was Charlotte. "Beck, you won't believe it. I got the tickets for that sustainable architecture exhibition at MIT next week. I thought it would be good for you, you know, to see how the projects that Michael admired are influencing a new generation." Rebecca looked again at the letter in her hands. MIT, Marcus Sullivan, professor of architecture. The coincidences seemed too great. "Char, I need to tell you something." Rebecca took a deep breath. "I got a letter today from the current resident of Michael's apartment." The silence on the other end of the line was broken by a surprised exclamation. "Oh my God, Beck. How are you feeling?" "Honestly, I don't know. It's like someone just changed the rules of a game I've been playing for 2 years." After hanging up, Rebecca reread Marcus' letter several times. Each reading revealed new details, new nuances in his carefully chosen words. He, too, knew the pain of loss. There was something comforting in knowing that someone understood, even if it was a stranger. She spent the rest of the day distracted, her thoughts constantly returning to the letter. In the moments between client meetings and contract reviews, she found herself wondering what Marcus Sullivan was like. What kind of loss had he suffered? How did he deal with his own pain? In the evening, in her apartment, Rebecca sat at her usual desk, but this time it was different. The blank paper in front of her seemed more intimidating than usual. How could she respond to someone who had inadvertently become a witness to her most vulnerable moments? After several failed attempts, he finally began. "Dear Marcus, I confess that your letter took me completely by surprise. For 2 years, my words to Michael disappeared into the void, and now, to discover that someone has read them, that someone has understood them, is both frightening and comforting. You don't have to apologize for reading my letters. If our roles had been reversed, you probably would have done the same. There's something about the words of suffering people that calls to us, perhaps because we recognize echoes of our own pain in them. It's strange to know that you live where Michael did, that you walk through the same rooms, see the same views from the window. Even stranger is knowing that you teach about his work, that somehow, through you, his legacy lives on." Rebecca paused, looking at the words she had just written. It was the first time in 2 years that she had written to someone who would actually reply. It felt different, more real, more frightening. "You mentioned that you also know the pain of loss. You don't have to tell me about it if you don't want to, but I want you to know that your words about understanding my longing meant a lot. Sometimes it feels like the whole world wants us to move on, to get over it, as if love and pain can simply be shelved and forgotten. about continuing to send letters. Maybe we can maintain the unlikely connection. There's something comforting in knowing that someone reads my words with understanding, without judgment. Sincerely, Rebecca. She reread the letter several times before finally sealing it in the envelope. It was different from the letters she had written to Michael, more restrained, more self-conscious, but it still carried an honesty that surprised her. That night, lying in her bed, Rebecca thought about the twists and turns of life. How a simple envelope could change everything, how a stranger could suddenly become a confidant, how the address that for so long represented only her loss now offered an unexpected possibility of connection. The sound of the rain against the window lulled her as she contemplated what the future might bring. For the first time in a long time, there was an element of surprise in her routine of morning, a glimmer of something new and unplanned. Before falling asleep, her thoughts were turned to the exhibition at MIT that Charlotte had mentioned. Would she meet Marcus there? The idea made her anxious and curious at the same time. With these confusing thoughts, Rebecca finally fell asleep. Marcus' letter safely tucked away in her bedside table, like a talisman of unexplored possibilities. The Sustainable Architecture exhibition at MIT was packed that Thursday evening. Rebecca nervously adjusted the collar of her navy blue blazer as she walked alongside Charlotte through the corridors of the main building. Her eyes anxiously scanned the faces in the crowd, wondering if any of them might be Marcus Sullivan. "Are you sure you want to do this?" Charlotte asked, noticing her friend's unease. "We can leave if you're uncomfortable." Rebecca shook her head. "No, I need to be here. It's like the universe is pushing me into this, you know?" The space was transformed into a temporary gallery, with explanatory panels and models of sustainable projects. In the center of the main hall, Rebecca immediately recognized the model of Michael's community center. Her heart raced when she saw his name on the descriptive plaque, "Original Project, Michael Bennett, 1987 to 2021. "Ladies and gentlemen," a voice announced over the PA system, "in 15 minutes we will have our keynote lecture on the evolution of sustainable architecture in Boston with Professor Marcus Sullivan." Rebecca froze. Until that moment, Marcus had been just words on a page, an abstract presence occupying Michael's old space. Now, he was about to become real. "Beck, breathe," Charlotte whispered, holding her arm. "You look pale." Before Rebecca could respond, a tall man of around 35 took to the small stage. His dark brown hair had a few gray strands at the temples, and his eyes, even from a distance, looked kind behind his thin-framed glasses. He was wearing a gray sweater over a white shirt, with a posture that mixed professionalism and casualness. "Good evening, everyone. I'm Marcus Sullivan," he began, his voice surprisingly soft for someone who commanded so much attention. "Today we're going to discuss how Boston has become an epicenter of innovation in sustainable architecture, thanks to visionaries like Michael Bennett." Rebecca felt her legs go weak. It was surreal to hear Michael's name mentioned by Marcus, to create this tangible connection between his past and his present. Charlotte guided her to a nearby chair, worried about her reaction. During the talk, Marcus spoke passionately about various projects, but devoted special time to Michael's community center. "This particular project," he said, "represents everything we aspire to in modern architecture: sustainability, functionality, and beauty. Bennett has managed to create a space that not only serves the community, but also educates about environmental awareness." Rebecca watched Marcus' every gesture, every expression, trying to reconcile the man on stage with the gentle words of his letters. There was a sincerity in his enthusiasm that touched her deeply. After the lecture, as people dispersed to examine the exhibits, Rebecca remained seated, torn between the desire to introduce herself and the fear of what it might mean. "Do you want to talk to him?" Charlotte asked softly. Rebecca began, but her answer was interrupted by a group of students who surrounded Marcus with questions. She watched him interact with them, patient and engaged, until his phone vibrated in his bag. It was an urgent message from his office about an important case. "I have to go," she told Charlotte, a mixture of relief and disappointment in her voice. "An emergency has arisen with the Stevens case." "Beck, you can't be serious. After coming all this way?" "Maybe it's for the best," Rebecca replied, standing up. "Some things are safer on paper." As she headed for the exit, Rebecca took one last look at Marcus, who was now leaning over a model, explaining some technical detail to his students. For a brief moment, their gazes met across the hall. He smiled politely, without recognition, and she felt a tightness in her chest as she realized that, to him, she was just another face in the crowd. Back in her apartment, late at night, Rebecca sat down at her desk and began to write, "Dear Marcus, today I saw you for the first time. You didn't see me, or rather, you saw me, but you didn't know me. I was at your lecture at MIT. I heard you talk about Michael, about his work, about the legacy he left behind. It was surreal and comforting at the same time. You have a way of talking about architecture that reminded me of him, not in the specific words, but in the enthusiasm, the passion for the impact that a good project can have on people's lives. I almost introduced myself. I came close several times, but something stopped me. Perhaps fear of making it all too real, of turning our letters into something other than what they are." Rebecca paused, considering whether to mention the moment when their gazes met. She decided not to. Some things were best kept to herself. Continue to be my anonymous correspondent for now. There's something special about getting to know someone first through their words, about building a connection that exists purely on paper and ink. Sincerely, Rebecca. She sealed the envelope and placed it on her desk, promising herself that she would send it in the morning. Through the window, the lights of Boston twinkled like earthly stars, and Rebecca thought about how life had curious ways of intertwining destinies. In his office at MIT, Marcus was also awake, reviewing notes for his classes the next day. His thoughts occasionally wandered to Rebecca's letters, wondering if she would ever appear at one of his lectures. Little did he know that she had already been there. So close and yet so far away, like two planets in orbits that almost touch but never really meet. Marcus was correcting work in his office when Rebecca's new letter arrived. His heart raced as he recognized the familiar handwriting on the envelope. When he read about her presence at his lecture, a strange feeling came over him. She had been there, probably among the dozens of faces he had observed during his presentation. "You have a way of talking about architecture that reminded me of him." Rebecca's words made him pause. It was a comparison that made him both proud and uncomfortable. After all, the more he read about Michael through Rebecca's letters, the more he admired his work and the person he had been. That afternoon, after his classes, Marcus decided to visit the community center designed by Michael. The building, with its innovative structure and clever use of natural light, was even more impressive in person than in the plans and photos he had studied. As he walked through the corridors, observing how the late afternoon light came through the skylight, the same one Rebecca had mentioned in one of her first letters, Marcus began to understand Michael's vision better. Every detail had a purpose, every architectural element told a story. "Professor Sullivan?" A voice surprised him. It was Robert Chen, Michael's former partner on the project. "I thought I recognized you from the lecture at MIT." "Mr. Chen," Marcus extended his hand. "It's an honor to meet you in person. Your work on finishing this project is extraordinary." Robert smiled, a smile that carried a mixture of pride and melancholy. "Michael had this incredible vision. I just helped bring it to life." He paused, observing the space around him. "You know, sometimes I still expect to see him coming through the door with some crazy new idea about sustainability." "How well did you know him?" Marcus asked, suddenly feeling like an outsider. "We were friends as well as partners. I was at his engagement to Rebecca." Robert sighed. "Do you know Rebecca Mason? She still comes around here sometimes, usually when she thinks no one will notice." Marcus felt his stomach turn. "Not personally," he replied, technically not lying, "but I've heard about her." Robert led him to his office, where photos of the construction process decorated the walls. In one of them, Michael and Rebecca were smiling side by side during what appeared to be an inauguration party for another project. "It was taken 6 months before the accident," Robert explained, noticing Marcus' interest in the photo. "They were the kind of couple that made you believe in soulmates, you know? The way they complemented each other." Marcus looked closely at the picture. Rebecca was even more beautiful than he had imagined. Her eyes sparkled with a joy that was absent in the melancholy words of his letters. Was the accident really as unexpected as they say? Marcus caught himself asking. Robert sat down heavily in his chair. Completely. Michael was picking Rebecca up from her office during a snowstorm. She blames herself to this day, but no one could have seen it coming. Life is sometimes cruel in its randomness. That evening, back in his apartment, Marcus couldn't stop thinking about everything he had discovered. He sat down to write his reply to Rebecca. Dear Rebecca, today I visited the community center. I met Robert Chen, who showed me photos and shared stories. I didn't mention our letters, but I confess it was hard to keep it a secret while he spoke about you and Michael with such affection. I now understand why you didn't introduce yourself at the lecture. Sometimes it's easier to keep certain distances, to preserve certain mysteries, but I want you to know that your invisible presence changed something that evening. Perhaps that's why I spoke about Michael's work with even more passion. You mentioned that my way of talking about architecture reminded you of him. I don't know if I deserve that comparison, but it touched me deeply. The truth is, the more I learn about his work, the more I realize how much we still have to learn from his vision. Marcus paused, considering whether to share his own grief with her. After a moment's reflection, he continued, You've already asked me about my own experience with loss. 5 years ago, I lost my sister Claire to cancer. She was 25 and in her final year of medical school. Like you, I also wrote letters, dozens of them, but I never had the courage to send them. Perhaps that's why your words touched me so much from the start. Claire loved sustainable architecture. It was she who inspired me to follow this path in my academic research. Sometimes, when I'm teaching or working on a project, I can still hear her voice teasing me about some technical detail I forgot to consider. A tear fell onto the paper, causing the ink to smudge slightly. Marcus took a deep breath before continuing. Maybe that's why fate decided that your letters should reach me. Two people who know the pain of loss, connected through words and memories at an address that carries so many stories. I respect your desire to keep our correspondence as it is. There is something special about getting to know someone first through their words, about building a connection that exists in the space between the real and the imagined. Yours affectionately, Marcus. After sealing the envelope, Marcus opened his desk drawer and took out an old box. Inside were dozens of letters to Claire, never sent, yellowed by time. Perhaps it was time to share some of them with someone who would understand. Autumn in Cambridge painted the trees red and gold, and as night fell, Marcus thought about how the seasons change, how life continues its inexorable cycle of loss and renewal. Somewhere in Boston, Rebecca was also watching the same trees, reading his words, unknowingly sharing the same moment of reflection under the same autumn sky. Autumn was advancing in Boston when Rebecca received Marcus' last letter. Sitting on her sofa with a cup of chamomile tea in her hands, she reread his words about Claire for the third time. The revelation about her sister had created a new dimension in their connection, a deeper understanding of shared pain. She was the one who inspired me to follow this path in my academic research. The phrase echoed in her mind, reminding her of how Michael had also been her inspiration in so many aspects of her life. Even after his death, her choices were still influenced by what he would have thought or done. The phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. It was Robert Chen. Rebecca? Sorry to call like this, but I thought you should know. A professor from MIT visited the community center yesterday, Marcus Sullivan. He showed so much interest in Michael's work. Rebecca felt her heart race. What did you tell him, Robert? Just stories about the project, some photos. There was a pause, and I showed him that photo from the opening day. You know, the one. You were so happy that day, Beck. Michael was so proud. Robert, Rebecca hesitated, considering whether to tell him about the letters. She decided not to. Some things were better kept secret, at least for the time being. After hanging up, Rebecca walked over to her desk and opened the drawer where she kept all of Marcus' letters. She reread each one, noticing how her own voice had changed over the course of the correspondence. The first letters were full of raw pain and guilt, but gradually, something new had emerged. A kind of timid hope, perhaps? She took pen and paper and began to write, Dear Marcus, Robert told me about your visit to the community center. It's strange how our worlds are coming closer together, even when we try to keep our distance. Your story about Claire touched me deeply. There's something comforting about knowing that you really understand, not just as someone who witnesses another's grief, but as someone who carries their own scars. I've never told anyone about that night. About what really happened before the accident. Michael and I had discussed it earlier that day. I was pushing for a wedding date, and he wanted to wait until the community center was finished. It was our first serious fight in years. When I was stuck in the office because of the snow, part of me called him out of wounded pride, wanting to prove a point. See? I need you. What a cruel irony of fate to turn my little revenge into a permanent tragedy. Rebecca stopped, taking a deep breath. It was the first time she had put these feelings on paper, admitted in words the true source of her guilt. Maybe that's why your letters mean so much to me. They gave me permission to feel something other than guilt. Seeing how you talk about Michael's work, how you honor his legacy through your classes, makes me think that maybe there is a greater purpose in all of this. You asked between the lines of your last letter if we will ever meet properly. I confess I've been thinking about that a lot since the lecture, but I'm afraid, Marcus, afraid that by making it real, something will be lost. Our connection through words has been a special kind of magic, don't you think? The sun was beginning to set, painting her apartment in golden hues. Rebecca continued. Claire must have been an extraordinary person to inspire such love and dedication. Sometimes I wonder if our loved ones know how their departures have changed us, how their absences have created unexpected connections between strangers who share similar pains. I still visit Michael's grave every week. Before, it was a ritual of self-punishment. Now it's different. I tell him about your letters, about how you're keeping your work alive through your students. I know he'd approve. As for the letters you wrote to Claire, if you ever want to share them, I promise to guard them as carefully as I guard mine to Michael. Sometimes the unspoken words are the ones that most need to be read by someone who understands. With love, Rebecca. After sealing the envelope, Rebecca grabbed her coat and decided to go for a walk. The cold October air had a cleansing effect, as if it could wipe away years of accumulated guilt. Her steps took her unconsciously to Fenway Park, where Michael had proposed. Sitting on a bench near the stadium, Rebecca watched the people passing by. Couples holding hands, families with children, elderly people sharing quiet moments. Life continued its inexorable flow, carrying everyone in its current. Her phone vibrated. A message from Charlotte. Dinner tonight? You need to tell me more about those mysterious letters. Rebecca smiled, typing an affirmative reply. It was time to share more of her life with the people around her, to allow the present to start taking up as much space as the past. As she walked back home, Rebecca thought of Marcus in his apartment, Michael's old apartment, perhaps sitting at the same desk where she used to sit and study during visits. There was a bittersweet poetry in this overlapping of lives, in this dance of fate that intertwined their stories in unexpected ways. In her handbag, the newly written letter weighed like a confession, like a step towards something new and unknown. Rebecca knew that every word she wrote brought her closer to a meeting that seemed more and more inevitable. The question was no longer whether they would meet, but when and how their lives would finally intersect beyond the words on paper. Autumn in Boston continued its inexorable march, the golden leaves dancing in the wind like loose pages of a story still being written. Marcus couldn't stop rereading Rebecca's confession about the night of the accident, the revelation about the argument with Michael, about the liaison motivated by wounded pride, added a new layer of complexity to the story he thought he knew. Sitting in his office at MIT, watching the November rain through the window, he wondered how to respond to such a display of trust. The phone on his desk rang, interrupting his thoughts. It was Andrea, his department colleague. Marcus, you won't believe it. I've just heard that Rebecca Mason is going to be the guest speaker at the Environmental Law Symposium next week. Apparently, she's one of the leading experts on sustainable building legislation. His heart leapt. Here at MIT? Yes, in the main auditorium. I thought you'd like to know, since you're using the Bennett Community Center project as a case study in your classes. Marcus thanked him for the information and hung up, his mind spinning with possibilities. Fate seemed determined to bring them together, even when they tried to keep their distance. That evening, in his apartment, the apartment that still carried silent echoes of Michael, Marcus finally began to write his reply. Dear Rebecca, your honesty has left me speechless for days. The courage to confess something you've kept for so long has made me think about the secrets I also carry. You gave me a precious gift with your truth, and I feel I must repay you with mine. The night Claire died, I was supposed to be with her in hospital. It was my turn to be by her side, but I had an important presentation at college the next day. She insisted that I go home and rest. "I'll be here tomorrow, little brother," she said with that stubborn smile. But I wasn't. I spent years blaming myself for not being there in her last moments, for choosing my career over my sister. Like you, I turned this guilt into a ritual of self-punishment. Every professional achievement was accompanied by a shadow of remorse. Marcus paused, taking a deep breath before continuing. "Maybe that's why your letters touched me so much from the start. I recognized in your words the same kind of pain I carry. The difference is that you had the courage to put that pain on paper, to send it out into the world, even without expecting a response." About Robert and his visit to the community center. "I confess it was surreal to see your photo with Michael. You looked so happy, so full of plans. I saw the same sparkle in his eyes that Claire had when she talked about medicine, that certainty that he was exactly where he was supposed to be, doing exactly what he was supposed to be doing." The sound of an ambulance passing in the street made Marcus pause. He remembered the countless times he had visited Claire in hospital, the sound of the machines keeping his sister alive, the smell of antiseptic that still made him shudder. "You mentioned being afraid of meeting, of losing the magic of this connection we've created through words. I understand that fear. There's something safe in distance, in the ability to choose each word carefully, to process each emotion before sharing it. But Rebecca, I need to tell you something. Next week, you're giving a lecture here at MIT on environmental legislation. When I heard, my first impulse was to cancel all my classes that day so as not to risk meeting you. Then I realized how cowardly that sounded." Marcus stood up and walked over to the window. The lights of Cambridge flickered in the night, each one representing a life, a story, a set of choices and consequences. Maybe the universe is trying to tell us something. All these coincidences, me living in Michael's apartment, using his work in my classes, you lecturing at MIT, seem part of a bigger plan that we can't fully understand. I've attached one of the letters I wrote to Claire to this letter. It's about the day she convinced me to change my research area to sustainable architecture. "The world needs more people who care about the future," she said. I think Michael felt the same way. "I'm not suggesting that we meet at your lecture. I respect your desire to keep our connection as it is. But I want you to know that I will be there, among the audience, listening to your words not just as a professor interested in environmental law, but as someone who knows your heart through your letters. If you look for me, you'll find me. If you prefer to keep our distance, I will respect your choice." Sometimes I think that Claire and Michael somehow orchestrated this unlikely meeting between us, two wounded souls who found comfort in each other's words. With affection, Marcus. He sealed the envelope along with one of the letters to Claire, feeling as if he was sharing a precious piece of his soul. The letter chosen was special, stained with coffee and with little drawings in the margins, typical of his sister's playful way of commenting on his projects. The following week, Rebecca's lecture loomed like a promise on the horizon. Autumn was taking its last breaths in Cambridge, and the trees on campus, almost bare of leaves, looked like silent sentinels guarding secrets that only time would reveal. Marcus knew he had reached a point of no return. His next choice, whether or not to attend the lecture, would define the course of his connection with Rebecca. How would she react to knowing he would be in the audience? Would the words they had shared be strong enough to survive a real encounter? As these questions consumed him, Marcus realized that, for the first time since Claire's death, he was more anxious about the future than tormented by the past. Rebecca's letters had done that for him, and he hoped his words had had a similar effect on her. The day of Rebecca's lecture at MIT dawned with a fine mist covering Cambridge. In her office at the law firm, she was rehearsing her presentation on environmental legislation for the 10th time, but her thoughts kept returning to Marcus' last letter and the letter from Claire that he had shared. Claire's words, scribbled with drawings in the margins and coffee stains, were so full of life that they made Rebecca feel as if she knew the young medical student. "The world needs more people who care about the future." The phrase echoed in her mind, painfully reminding her of similar conversations with Michael. Charlotte entered his office without knocking, carrying 2 cups of coffee. "You look terrible," she declared, placing one of the cups on Rebecca's desk. "Didn't you sleep?" I spent the night rereading the letters, Rebecca admitted, rubbing her tired eyes. Marcus is going to be at the lecture today. Charlotte sat down in the chair opposite the table. And that's bad because it's easier to keep all this. Rebecca gestured to the pile of letters in her drawer. In the realm of the abstract, on paper, we can be idealized versions of ourselves. In real life, you are two people who have connected in an extraordinary way through shared pain, Charlotte added softly. Beck, when was the last time you allowed yourself the possibility of something new? Rebecca looked out of the window, watching the city awaken. It's not about something new, Char. It's about honoring what's been lost. Michael always said that the best way to honor the past was to build a better future, Charlotte replied, quoting words Michael himself had said so many times. Do you think he would want you to live like this, trapped between letters and memories? The words hit Rebecca like a punch in the gut. On her desk, the laptop showed the slides from her presentation on sustainability and environmental legislation, a job she had started because of Michael, but which had become her own passion over the years. I need to get ready for the lecture, Rebecca said, a clear indication that the conversation was over. Charlotte stood up, but stopped at the door. You know what else Michael always said? That architecture isn't about building walls, but about creating spaces where life happens. Maybe it's time to create that space for yourself, Beck. Meanwhile, at MIT, Marcus was restless in his office. The letter he had received from Rebecca in response to his confession about Claire was on his desk, still unopened. Something had prevented him from reading it before the lecture. Andrea appeared at his door. The auditorium is almost ready. Rebecca Mason will arrive in 2 hours for the final preparations. Thanks, Marcus replied distractedly, his eyes fixed on the envelope. Are you okay? You look tense. Marcus forced a smile. Just looking forward to the lecture. Her work on environmental legislation is fundamental to our sustainable architecture projects. Andrea nodded, although her look suggested that she suspected there was more to the story. Well, I'll be in the front row if you need moral support. When she left, Marcus finally opened Rebecca's letter. Dear Marcus, your letter about Claire made me cry. Not of sadness, but of recognition. Recognition of the love you shared, of the guilt you carry, of the way you turned your pain into purpose through your work. When I read about Claire, I see so much of Michael in her. This passion for making the world a better place, this ability to inspire others to be better. Maybe that's why we met through these letters. Maybe Claire and Michael somehow knew that we needed each other. About the lecture, part of me wants to run away. It would be easier to cancel, to keep our connection safe in the pages of those letters. But then I think about what Michael would say, what Claire would apparently say, about courage and purpose and doing the things that scare us. Then I'll be there. And if our gazes meet in the audience, maybe it's time to let the unspoken words finally find voice. With love, Rebecca. Marcus reread the letters several times, each word reverberating with a truth that went beyond paper and ink. He looked at his watch, 1 hour until the lecture. He picked up his folder with the students' work on Michael's community center and started walking towards the auditorium. The campus was quiet that winter morning, with students hurrying between buildings to escape the cold. Marcus thought of Claire, how she loved days like this, saying that the cold made everything sharper, more real. As he walked, Marcus realized that, whatever happened at the lecture, something fundamental had changed through those letters. Both he and Rebecca had begun to see their losses not just as holes in their lives, but as bridges to something new, something that neither Claire nor Michael could have foreseen, but that perhaps had been waiting for them. The auditorium was empty when he arrived, the rows of chairs silently awaiting what was to come. Marcus chose a seat in the middle, not too close, not too far from the stage. From his briefcase, he took Rebecca's last letter and placed it on the seat next to him, like a talisman for what was about to happen. Soon, that space would fill up with people, and among them, two souls who had met through words written on paper would now face the challenge of turning their connection into something real, tangible, present. The weight of unspoken words hung in the air, waiting for the right moment to finally be spoken. The MIT auditorium gradually began to fill up. Rebecca remained backstage, nervously adjusting the slides of her presentation while watching the audience through a small gap in the curtain. Her eyes roamed the rows of seats, inevitably looking for Marcus, even if she didn't know exactly what he looked like. Charlotte appeared silently beside her. "You're looking for him, aren't you? Is it that obvious?" Rebecca asked, smiling nervously. "Only to someone who's known you for 15 years, Charlotte replied, adjusting a loose thread on her friend's blazer. "You know what's funny? You're more nervous than the day you argued that multimillion-dollar case before the Massachusetts Supreme Court." Rebecca laughed softly, but her laughter was interrupted when she saw Andrea Thompson, the MIT professor who had organized the lecture, approaching with a tall man in thin-framed glasses. Her heart stopped for a moment. Was it Marcus? "Rebecca, this is Professor James Chern, head of the Environmental Engineering Department," Andrea introduced. Rebecca felt a mixture of relief and disappointment. Meanwhile, in the middle rows of the auditorium, Marcus was settling into his chair, Rebecca's last letter folded carefully in his pocket. Andrea had tried to persuade him to sit in the front row with the other teachers, but he preferred to keep a low profile, at least initially. "Ladies and gentlemen," Andrea's voice echoed through the microphone, "it is with great pleasure that we introduce our guest speaker, Rebecca Mason, one of the country's leading experts on environmental law and sustainability." Marcus straightened up in his chair as Rebecca appeared on stage. She looked even more beautiful than in the photo he had seen in Robert Chen's office, her red hair in an elegant bun, a navy blue blazer that perfectly matched her professional demeanor. But it was her eyes that captured him. There was a depth in them that the letters had already revealed, a mixture of strength and vulnerability that he knew so well. Rebecca began her presentation with confidence, her firm voice echoing through the auditorium as she discussed the complexities of environmental legislation applied to sustainable architecture. Marcus watched, fascinated, as she occasionally gestured in the same way she described in her letters. "The case of the Bennett Community Center," Rebecca said, and her voice shook slightly at the mention of the name, "represents a milestone in the integration of sustainable design and legal compliance." Her eyes roamed the audience as she spoke about Michael's project, and for a moment, her gaze met Marcus. There was a moment of recognition, a silent connection that made them both hold their breath. Rebecca hesitated for a split second before continuing her presentation, but her heart was pounding uncontrollably. Marcus felt the weight of the letter in his pocket, her words echoing in his mind. If our gazes meet in the audience, perhaps it's time to let the unspoken words finally find voice. The presentation continued, with Rebecca answering questions from the audience with eloquence and deep knowledge. Marcus noticed how she occasionally touched the necklace she was wearing, a gesture she had mentioned in one of her letters as something she did when she was nervous. When the lecture ended, there was a moment of confusion as people stood up and started to move around. Rebecca was surrounded by professors and students interested in asking additional questions. Marcus remained in his seat, watching, waiting. Charlotte, who had been watching the entire silent dynamic between the two, approached Rebecca. "He's here, isn't he?" she whispered. Rebecca nodded discreetly, continuing to answer questions from those present. Her eyes occasionally searched the crowd for Marcus, but he had disappeared from her field of vision. Gradually, the auditorium emptied. Rebecca began to put away her materials, her hands shaking slightly. Charlotte had stepped aside to give her space, intuitively understanding that this moment needed to belong to Rebecca and Marcus alone. "Your presentation was excellent," a familiar voice said behind her. Rebecca froze. It was the same voice she had heard at the lecture on sustainable architecture, now addressed directly to her. She turned around slowly. Marcus was standing a few steps away, holding one of her cards. Even though she had seen him during the lecture, seeing him like this, up close, was different. His eyes were gentle behind his glasses, just as she had imagined from his words. "Marcus," she said softly, and the name came out like a confession. "Rebecca," he replied, and there was so much in the two syllables. Recognition, nervousness, hope. They were silent for a moment, the weight of all the words they had exchanged through the letters hanging between them. The auditorium was almost empty now, just a few distant people organizing equipment. "It's strange," Rebecca finally said, "meeting someone for the first time when you already know them so well." Marcus smiled, and it was the same gentle smile she had imagined when reading his letters. "Do you think Claire and Michael planned this?" he asked, half joking, half serious. Rebecca felt tears forming in her eyes, but for the first time in a long time, they weren't tears of sadness. Knowing Michael, he's probably somewhere laughing at how predictable we are. Claire would love that whole story, Marcus said, taking a step towards her. She always said that the best stories start with a letter. Rebecca looked at the letter he was holding. It was the last one she had sent. Have you read it? Not yet, he admitted. I wanted to wait until after I'd met you in person. The silence that followed was full of unspoken possibilities, of paths that might or might not be taken. Through the tall windows of the auditorium, the late afternoon light painted everything in golden hues, as if the universe itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. The golden light of late afternoon continued to bathe the MIT auditorium as Rebecca and Marcus stood face to face, the weight of months of correspondence hanging between them. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was as if they were both savoring the moment, allowing the reality of their meeting to finally set in. There's a cafe nearby, Marcus finally said, nervously adjusting his glasses. They make that cinnamon coffee you mentioned in one of your letters. Rebecca smiled, recognizing the reference to her first letter. The same one Michael liked. If you prefer somewhere else, Marcus began, but Rebecca gently interrupted him. No, it's perfect. I think we've spent enough time avoiding places and memories. Charlotte, who was watching discreetly from the entrance to the auditorium, gave Rebecca a little wave before leaving them alone with their shared stories and unexplored possibilities. The cafe was a few minutes' walk from the campus. The cold November air enveloped them as they crossed the MIT courtyard, passing hurried students and distracted professors. It was strange, Rebecca thought, how something as monumental as this meeting could seem so ordinary to the rest of the world. Did you always know it was me in the audience? Marcus asked as they walked. Not immediately, Rebecca admitted, but when our gazes met, there was something familiar, like recognizing a voice you've only heard in your dreams. At the cafe, they chose a table by the window. The place had that cozy atmosphere of academic establishments, bookshelves on the walls, soft jazz music in the background, the aroma of freshly ground coffee permeating the air. It's funny, Marcus said after they'd placed their orders, how I've spent weeks imagining this moment, and now that it's happening, I realize that none of the conversations I've rehearsed in my mind seem appropriate. Rebecca laughed softly. I know exactly what you mean. It's easier to be eloquent on paper, isn't it? Much easier, he agreed, taking her last letter out of his pocket. Can I read it now? Rebecca nodded, watching as he carefully opened the envelope. His eyes followed the words she had written, and she could see different emotions crossing his face. You're right, he finally said, folding the letter carefully. About Claire and Michael leading us here. I don't believe in coincidences, not after all this. Neither do I, Rebecca replied, instinctively touching the necklace she was wearing, a gift from Michael. Do you know what's strangest? For the first time in 2 years, I don't feel guilty about being here, living in this moment. Marcus reached across the table, not quite touching hers, but close enough to share the warmth. Claire always said that guilt was a weight we carry by choice. It took me a long time to understand what she meant. And now I understand that we honor those we've lost best when we allow their memories to guide us forward, not hold us back in the past. The cinnamon coffee arrived, and Rebecca closed her eyes as she smelled the familiar aroma. Michael used to say that every project was a love letter to the future. I think our letters were that too, in a way. Letters to the future, Marcus repeated thoughtfully. I like that. They talked for hours, their words flowing naturally now that the first tension had passed. They talked about Claire and her passion for medicine, about Michael and his architectural dreams. They shared stories they'd never put in their letters, laughed at coincidences they discovered, cried over lost moments. When they finally left the cafe, night had fallen over Cambridge. The campus lights created an almost magical scene, with shadows dancing between the historic buildings. I want to show you something, Marcus said, guiding her across campus to the architecture department. In his office, he turned on the lights and walked over to a drawing board where a project was spread out. It's a sustainability research center, he explained. Based on some of the principles Michael developed, But with adaptations for the new technologies that have emerged, I'd like you to take a look at the legal side of the project. Rebecca studied the drawings, recognizing elements of Michael's style mixed with something new, something uniquely Marcus. "It's beautiful," she said sincerely. "And yes, I'd love to help with the legal part." "Then we'll have to meet again," Marcus said, a slight smile on his lips. "I guess so," Rebecca replied, returning the smile. As they left the building, they stopped for a moment under the November stars. Rebecca took an envelope out of her blazer pocket. "I wrote this morning," she said, handing it to Marcus. "My last letter to Michael. I wanted you to read it." Marcus accepted the envelope with reverence. "Are you sure?" "I'm sure. I think I'm finally ready to stop writing to the past and start writing to the future." They said goodbye with the promise of a new meeting, a new letter, a new beginning. Rebecca watched Marcus disappear into the night before starting her own walk home. In her apartment, she sat at her antique oak desk, as she had done so many times before. But this time, instead of tears of longing, there was a smile on her lips as she began to write. "Dear Marcus, today I got to know you beyond the words on paper, and I discovered that some stories are even more beautiful when they have a voice." In his apartment in Cambridge, Michael's old apartment, Marcus was also writing, his last letter to Claire resting next to his new project. "Dear Claire, you were right, as always. The best stories really do begin with a letter." Autumn in Boston continued its eternal dance, the last golden leaves swirling in the streets like loose pages from a book still being written, and somewhere, perhaps, Michael and Claire were smiling, satisfied that they had guided two lost souls back to the path of hope, one letter at a time.